Little girl sitting outside a hotel. Then, a millionaire CEO said something unbelievable. The evening air was heavy with a biting chill, sharp enough to make even the wealthiest guests of the hotel pull their coats closer and hurry inside. Yet on the wide marble steps of the grand building, a small figure sat perfectly still, as though she had long ago accepted the cold as part of her existence. Her dress, once stitched with care, now hung loosely on her thin frame, its fabric torn and frayed at the edges, faded to a color that no one could name anymore. And though it told the story of many nights spent under the open sky, the girl wore it quietly, without complaint. Her eyes were large, glassy, and filled with exhaustion, but they carried a depth beyond her years, a silent echo of burdens too heavy for one so young. The guests walked by in their polished shoes, silk gowns and pressed suits, speaking in laughter and whispers about their glamorous dinners and expensive wines, and not a single one turned their head to acknowledge the fragile child sitting only inches away from their glittering path. She clutched a doll tightly against her chest, a doll just as worn as her dress, with faded fabric, torn seams, and a button eye dangling by a thread. Yet in her hands it became a treasure, a shield against loneliness, and perhaps her only reminder that once she too had been loved. The marble beneath her was hard and merciless, biting into her small body. But she did not shift to ease the pain. She had grown used to discomfort, to hunger, to the sharp wind on her face, and to the sound of doors closing where she had never been invited to enter. The golden lights above the hotel glowed warmly, bathing the steps in brightness, yet none of it reached her, for light without compassion was only a shadow pretending to be warmth. She pulled her knees to her chest, hugging herself too, idly, trying to appear smaller, quieter, perhaps even invisible, as if vanishing into the stone might protect her from the sting of being ignored. A group of guests passed by, their jewels sparkling, their laughter echoing like bells in the night, but they stepped around her as though she were no more than part of the architecture, something to be walked past without thought. A waiter carrying silver trays swept by, and with him came the rich aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread, scents that made her stomach twist with an ache that had long become her companion. Yet she made no sound, no plea, no movement, only lowered her eyes and held the doll closer. The revolving doors of the hotel spun endlessly, each rotation releasing a brief burst of warm air scented with perfume and tobacco, teasing her with the comfort she could never have, a reminder that a world of luxury was only a few steps away, yet impossibly far. Her shoes, if they could be called that, were little more than scraps of fabric and worn leather, thin against the chill, and so she tucked her feet beneath her torn dress, shielding them as best as she could from the biting stone. Her hair was tangled, uncombed, catching the flickers of lamplight in strands that whispered of innocence still hidden beneath hardship, but the harshness of her stillness made her seem far older than her fragile years. She did not stretch her hand toward the passers-by, did not whisper for help, did not beg for coins like others might have done, for she carried within her a quiet pride, or perhaps a hope that kindness should come freely and not by demand. Her silence was louder than any plea, a silence that seemed to cry out for compassion, though no one paused to listen. A carriage rolled past on the cobblestone street, its wheels rattling, the horses snorting into the night, but she did not turn her head. Her gaze was fixed on the steps before her, as though the stone itself was her anchor. The scents of the city mixed together in the air, the sweetness of perfume, the bitterness of smoke, the richness of food, and each one struck her differently, reminding her of what she had, and more painfully, what she had lost. She pressed her face into the worn fabric of her doll, whispering words only it could hear, soft and secret, perhaps the memory of a lullaby, perhaps a prayer, perhaps nothing more than the comfort of hearing her own voice in the solitude. The doorman, tall in his crisp uniform, shifted uncomfortably each time his eyes almost landed on her, but training and habit told him to look away, to keep the image of perfection intact, and so he did, retreating into indifference. The girl blinked slowly, her lashes heavy, her body weighed down by exhaustion, but she resisted the temptation to close her eyes, for she had learned that to sleep in such places meant to be chased away, or worse, to lose the little security she had in her spot. Another burst of laughter floated from a couple ascending the steps, their arms linked, their joy radiant and unbothered, and for one fleeting moment, the girl let herself imagine what it would feel like to be held so warmly, to belong to someone, to laugh without hunger gnawing inside. But the vision dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving her again in the silence of reality, her back pressed against the cold stone. A carriage door slammed, heels clicked against the pavement, voices called for luggage, yet through it all she remained still, her small body part of the shadows, her presence unnoticed except by the wind that tugged at her hair. She shifted slightly, adjusting her doll's head against her chest, and a sigh escaped her lips, a sigh not of frustration but of deep weariness, the sound of a soul that had carried too many nights of loneliness for such a short life. The sky stretched above her, dark and endless, clouds hiding the stars, as though even the heavens had turned their eyes away, leaving the streets to owe their indifference. The lamps lining the road flickered to life, casting long, distorted shapes across the pavement, shadows that seemed to dance and stretch, embracing her small figure in their silent company. She sat among them like a forgotten secret, fragile yet unyielding, a child with nothing but a broken doll and a heart that still dared to wait. She did not know what she was waiting for, but she waited still, as if deep inside she believed that somewhere in the world kindness had not yet died, and that one day someone would see her. Behind her, the hotel glittered with chandeliers and laughter, the symbol of everything she did not have, yet on its steps sat a truth richer than all its gold. A child who asked for nothing, yet needed everything. A child whose silence was a question the world refused to answer. The night deepened, and the hum of the city wrapped around the glowing hotel entrance, when suddenly the quiet rhythm of the evening broke, with the smooth arrival of a sleek black car that pulled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the golden lights like a dark mirror. The engine gave a low purr before falling silent, and in that pause, the doorman straightened, smoothing his uniform as if preparing for someone of importance. The back door opened, and from the shadowed interior stepped a tall figure, his presence commanding yet graceful, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his suit tailored to perfection, each detail marking him as a man who belonged to the world of power and wealth. Whispers rippled immediately among the staff, carried in urgent breaths from one to another. Ethan Cross had arrived, the name spoken with a mixture of awe and caution, for he was not just a wealthy man, but a young millionaire CEO whose reputation for success had grown into legend. Ethan moved with the ease of someone accustomed to grand entrances, yet his eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the world around him not for chandeliers or flashing cameras, but for details others often overlooked. He adjusted his cufflinks absent-mindedly, his expression unreadable, when suddenly his gaze fell upon the small figure still sitting quietly on the marble steps, and in that instant his stride faltered. The girl did not shift or call out, did not even look up immediately, but the sight of her struck him differently than it had the countless guests who had passed her by. For reasons he could not yet explain, something about the contrast between her stillness and the chaos of wealth surrounding them tugged at his attention, and instead of moving forward into the welcoming glow of the hotel, he slowed his pace. The doorman hurried to greet him, eager to usher him past, but Ethan raised a hand gently, signaling that he needed no assistance. His polished shoes clicked softly against the stone as he approached the steps, closing the distance between a life of abundance and one of silence. The girl finally lifted her eyes, wide and uncertain, and their gazes met, his, calm and searching, hers, weary and guarded, yet holding a spark of surprise that someone had stopped at all. He did not tower over her with the cold indifference she expected. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, softening his stance, allowing his presence to seem less intimidating. A faint smile touched his lips, not the practiced smile he used in boardrooms or business dinners, but one tinged with genuine warmth, as though the sight of her had stirred something real within him. The air between them seemed to still, the laughter of guests fading into a distant murmur, the sounds of luggage rolling across stone becoming nothing more than background, as though the world had stepped aside for a conversation waiting to happen. And then, in a voice steady yet gentle, he said words she could never have expected from a man like him, words that landed with the weight of both confusion and wonder. "I'm hungry. Can you share a meal with me?" For a moment, the girl simply blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly, her mind struggling to place such a request into a world that made no sense. This was a man who could buy anything, dine anywhere, command entire kitchens to prepare feasts, and yet here he was, standing before her, asking her to share food as though they were equals. Her small fingers tightened around the doll she held, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out, for the thought itself was so astonishing that even words felt impossible. Ethan remained still, his smile patient, his eyes never leaving hers, as though he truly awaited an answer, as though in that moment nothing mattered more to him than the possibility of sharing a meal with a little girl on hotel steps. Around them, the world carried on. Carriages rattled, laughter spilled from the doors, guests moved in and out without noticing the exchange. But for the two of them, time had shifted into something quieter, something slower, something far more meaningful. The girl's breath caught in her throat as she stared up at Ethan. Her small face framed by tangled strands of hair, eyes widened in disbelief, for of all the things he could have said, of all the things he could have asked, this question seemed the most impossible. Her mind spun with confusion, unable to reconcile the sight of his expensive suit and polished shoes with the words that had just slipped so gently from his lips. And for a moment she wondered if he might be mocking her, though nothing in his expression suggested cruelty. Her thin fingers fidgeted nervously with the hem of her dress, and in that silence the ache of her stomach returned, sharp and relentless, reminding her how empty the day had been. Yet something deeper than hunger moved within her, something that whispered of trust in the kindness she sensed in his eyes. Slowly, as if emotion carried the weight of her entire world, she slipped one hand into the pocket of her worn dress, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric until they found the object she had guarded all day. Her heart raced as she drew it out, revealing a small piece of bread, not fresh, not whole, but precious to her, because it was the last she had, the only comfort she had saved against the uncertainty of the night. She looked down at it for a moment, torn between her own need and the request she had just heard, then lifted her gaze back to the man standing patiently before her. With trembling hands, she extended it toward him, her voice barely above a whisper, cracked and shy. "It's not much, but you can have it." The words seemed fragile, yet they carried a strength he had not expected. The strength of a child who, even in her own hunger, still found room for generosity. Ethan's heart clenched, a weight pressing against his chest as he looked at the small offering held out to him, the enormity of her gesture striking him harder than any boardroom negotiation or deal ever had. He reached forward slowly, his movements careful, reverent almost, as though the half-piece of bread were something sacred. When his fingers brushed against hers in taking it, he felt the chill of her skin, the roughness of small hands that had known more hardship than softness, and the realization deepened his ache. He lifted the bread, holding it in his palm, but instead of bringing it to his lips, he paused, lowering himself to one knee so that his eyes were level with hers. The world around them blurred into insignificance. The bustle of footsteps, the sweep of gowns, the calls of carriages, all faded against the quiet gravity of that moment. His voice softened, carrying a depth she could not yet understand, but felt nonetheless. And he said gently, "You just gave away the only thing you had. That makes you richer than me." The girl blinked rapidly, her breath quick and uneven, not quite knowing how to respond to words she had never imagined hearing. To her, she had simply done what seemed right, what her small heart had urged her to do, yet in his eyes, she had done something extraordinary, something that cut through the layers of wealth and power that usually defined his world. He kept his gaze steady on hers, letting her see the sincerity in his expression, the truth in his words, as though he wanted her to understand that her kindness had shifted something deep within him. She hugged her doll tighter with her free hand, her lips parting as if to speak. But no sound came, only the faint shimmer of tears beginning to gather in her tired eyes. Ethan noticed, and though he said nothing more just yet, his own throat tightened, for he realized that this fragile child had just taught him something no amount of success had ever been able to show. He glanced once more at the piece of bread, now resting gently in his palm, and it felt heavier than gold, for it carried not just sustenance, but the weight of sacrifice, the proof of a heart that still chose generosity in the midst of emptiness. And in that silence, a bond began to form between them, one not of wealth or pity, but of shared humanity, of a kindness that crossed every boundary of class and circumstance, binding them together in a way neither had expected. The moment Ethan heard her name, Lily, it sank into his heart like a fragile note of music, trembling yet unforgettable. And though it was just a simple name, it carried with it the weight of her entire existence. She said it softly, almost as if speaking it aloud might cause her to disappear, and Ethan leaned closer, his sharp, commanding presence softening in the glow of the hotel lights as he encouraged her to continue. Lily clutched her little doll tighter, as though the frayed toy were her shield, and slowly, timidly, she began to share the pieces of her life that had been buried in silence. She told him about the warmth of her parents, how her mother's lullabies once carried her into sleep, and how her father's laughter made her feel safe, but those memories now felt like faint echoes lost to time. Her mother had fallen ill first, her hands trembling as she tried to keep singing through her sickness, and Lily remembered sitting by her side, brushing her hair back, praying she would be better. Soon after, her father too grew weak, his once strong arms unable to carry her anymore, and before she could even understand what was happening, both were gone, leaving her with nothing but a doll and a hollow silence. Ethan felt a pressure in his chest as he listened, for every word she spoke painted pictures of grief no child should endure. Lily went on, her voice trembling, explaining how she learned to survive on her own, wandering the streets in search of scraps of food, sometimes lucky enough to find a piece of fruit, sometimes going to bed with nothing but hunger gnawing at her small stomach. She described nights spent under archways, the cold stone pressing against her back while the wind cut through her thin dress. She told him how she sometimes chose to sleep near the marketplace, just so the smells of bread and roasted food could trick her mind into feeling full. The doll in her hands had been her mother's final gift, pressed against her chest with weak fingers and a whisper that she must never let it go, and so it became her only companion, a reminder of love in a world that often forgot to show it. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight as he imagined her tiny figure cradling that doll in the darkness, pretending it could protect her from the hunger and fear. She confessed how she took up little chores, washing dishes with cold water that numbed her hands, sweeping the steps of shops, carrying loads far too heavy for her small arms, all for just a few ins that never stretched far enough. Sometimes those coins bought her a little bread, sometimes just enough for a thin soup, but never enough to ease her hunger completely. She spoke of strangers, some who turned away from her as if she were invisible, others who gave her glimmers of kindness. She remembered a baker who once slipped her a loaf and whispered that it had been a mistake in the oven, though she knew it was made only for her. She recalled a woman who saw her shivering in the winter air and wrapped a scarf around her shoulders with gentle hands, and she remembered a little boy who had offered her half of his biscuit, grinning shyly before running back to his mother. These small mercies became treasures to her, moments that reminded her she was still human, still seen. But not every moment was kind. Many days she endured ridicule, children pointing at her torn dress and dusty hair, laughing as though her pain were entertainment. She said she kept her head down then, never fighting back, because she had no strength to waste on anger. Ethan clenched his fists as he listened, anger rising within him at the thought of such cruelty directed at someone so small and innocent. Yet he stayed silent, giving her space, allowing her to continue. Lily admitted she never begged, even on nights when her hunger felt unbearable, because she believed her parents would not want her to lower herself that way. Instead, she chose to work, to struggle, to keep whatever dignity she could hold on to, even if it meant going to sleep with an empty stomach. Her voice softened when she shared that on the loneliest nights she sang songs her mother once taught her, melodies that floated into the cold night air, giving her comfort even when no one else could. Ethan felt his eyes sting as he pictured her tiny figure huddled in a corner, singing softly to herself under the stars, her voice true to all, embling yet brave against the silence of the city. Then came the part that broke him most, her whispered fear. She said she was afraid she would grow up forgotten, unseen, unloved, as though she were destined to fade away without anyone ever truly knowing her. Ethan's heart cracked open at those words, for he understood loneliness in his own way, but his loneliness had always been cushioned by wealth, by choice, while hers was sharp and merciless, carved into her soul without mercy. He realized her story was not just about hunger or poverty, it was about invisibility, about being erased by a world too busy to care. She hugged her doll tighter as she spoke those words, ashamed of her tears, but Ethan leaned closer, his voice gentle, telling her she had nothing to be ashamed of, because her story was not weakness but a testament to strength that few people in the world could ever understand. The bread she had given him earlier now carried a weight that shook him to his core, because he knew it came from someone who had nothing, yet still chose to give. He whispered her name again, Lily, letting it linger in the air like a vow, and her eyes widened slightly, surprised at hearing it spoken with such tenderness. She shifted nervously, uncertain if she should trust the warmth in his voice, but there was something in his presence that steadied her, something that made her feel seen for the first time in years. The night seemed to grow quieter around them as her words lingered, raw and sacred, and Ethan realized that no deal, no fortune, no empire he had ever built had moved him as deeply as this little girl's truth. The hotel glowed brightly behind them, its golden lights a stark contrast to the shadows that had swallowed Lily's childhood, but none of that grandeur mattered now. What mattered was her story, her courage, her survival. As Ethan looked into her glistening eyes, he felt something within himself shift, something he could not yet name, but he knew without question that he, airing Lily's story, had changed him forever. That night, Ethan did not step into the hotel lobby with its glittering chandeliers and polished marble floors, because his heart was already inside a different kind of room, one made of compassion and responsibility, and instead he turned toward Lily, her small hand resting in his as though it were the most fragile treasure he had ever held, and he whispered words that shook her entire world, telling her she would never sit hungry on those cold steps again. His voice carried not only a promise but a certainty, a vow carved in the sincerity of his soul, and as the night air wrapped around them, Lily blinked in disbelief, her eyes searching his face to see if this was another dream she would wake from too soon. Ethan led her away from the steps slowly, guiding her carefully, as though each step forward was pulling her out of the shadows of her past, and the first place he stopped was a quiet little restaurant where the soft glow of lanterns spilled warmth across the street, and the smell of fresh bread and roasted meals filled the air. Lily's tiny stomach growled at the scent, and her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but Ethan only smiled, pulling out a chair for her like she was royalty, and when plates of food began to arrive, her eyes widened at the sight of so much abundance placed before her. For a long moment she hesitated, her hands trembling above the bread, as though afraid someone might snatch it away. But Ethan encouraged her softly, telling her that everything on the table was for her, that she deserved to eat until she was full. She took the first bite slowly, almost reverently, and the warmth of the bread melted in her mouth, drawing tears to her eyes because she had never tasted anything so comforting in so long. And once she began, she could not stop, savoring every morsel as Ethan watched silently, his own heart swell, ling at the sight of her hunger finally being answered. He did not rush her, did not interrupt her. He only watched her reclaim something every child should have had without question: food, safety, dignity. When her hunger began to ease, he gently guided her to a clothing shop still open late, its lamps casting soft light on rows of dresses, shoes and coats. And for the first time Lily stood before choices she never dreamed she could make. Her small fingers brushed the fabrics, pausing on a simple blue dress that made her eyes shine brighter, and Ethan nodded with encouragement, telling her to choose whatever she wished. The shopkeeper, recognizing Ethan's stature, did not question, but instead bent down to Lily's height, treating her with gentleness as she tried on dresses, shoes, and even a little coat that wrapped her in warmth. When she looked in the mirror, she gasped quietly, unable to recognize the child standing there, no longer hidden in rags, but cloaked in dignity, and she turned toward Ethan shyly, as though asking if it was truly her reflection, and he nodded, smiling in a way he had not smiled in years. He paid without hesitation, his wealth finally being used in a way that felt like it mattered, and together they left the shop with bags of clothes that symbolized not just fabric, but the beginning of a new life. The night was growing colder, but Lily did not shiver, for Ethan guided her into a nearby inn, arranging a small, cozy room where a warm bed awaited, its soft blankets a world apart from the hard steps she had grown used to. When she stepped inside the room, she froze, staring at the bed with disbelief, her doll clutched tightly to her chest, as though seeking permission to believe this comfort was truly for her, and Ethan knelt beside her, assuring her gently that she could lie down, that the bed was hers, that safety was hers now. She sat first on the edge, testing the mattress as though it might vanish beneath her, then slowly stretched out on it, and the softness wrapped around her small body like an embrace she had long been denied, and tears filled her eyes again, though this time they were tears of relief. Ethan adjusted the blanket over her, tucking her in with a tenderness that surprised even him, for he had not cared for anyone like this in years, and Lily whispered softly that she felt like she was dreaming. He told her that this was not a dream, that she would never have to wake up to cold stone steps again, and as she hugged her doll tightly, her breathing began to slow, the weight of exhaustion overtaking her, and soon she drifted into sleep, her face peaceful for the first time in a long time. Ethan remained by the doorway, watching her sleep, realizing that the promise he had spoken was more than just words. It was a responsibility he was determined to honor, no matter the cost. The food, the clothes, the bed, they were all precious gifts, but the truest gift he had given her was invisible. The bond of belonging, the feeling of family, the knowledge that she was no longer alone in the world. For Lily, this night was not just about being fed or clothed, it was about being seen, being cared for, being loved again. And for Ethan, who had built empires and sat atop wealth and power, this night revealed a truth he had long forgotten. That purpose was not found in numbers or profits, but in the simple act of holding someone's hand and saying, "You will never be alone again." Weeks turned into months, and the seasons shifted gently, yet one thing remained constant, the bond that had formed between Ethan and Lily. Each morning carried a sense of renewal for her, a rhythm of life she had never known, as sunlight filtered through curtains instead of street lamps casting shadows. Ethan ensured she awoke to the smell of warm breakfast, not the uncertainty of hunger. He sat with her at the table sometimes, drinking coffee while she sipped milk, watching her eyes sparkle with the innocence of childhood slowly being restored. When enrollment day came, he held her hand tightly as they walked into the school gates, her small frame trembling with both excitement and fear. The sight of other children laughing and running filled her with longing, and Ethan noticed, reassuring her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. Teachers welcomed her kindly, and for the first time, Lily felt she belonged to a place where she was not invisible. Ethan filled out forms, signed papers, and made every arrangement as though she were his own daughter. The girl who had once been overlooked by the world now had her name written on official documents, her future secured in ink and intention. The first day she sat in class, her heart pounded, but she listened with eager ears, hungry not for food this time, but for knowledge. When she raised her hand to answer a question, the teacher's smile encouraged her, and pride swelled in Ethan's chest as he watched from the window. After school, he asked her what she learned, and she spoke in a rush of words, her joy spilling out like sunlight after rain. Ethan, once a man who measured time in meetings and deadlines, now measured it in her laughter and the brightness of her eyes. He visited her often, sometimes waiting by the school gates with a quiet smile, and every time Lily ran into his arms as though he were her safe harbor. Neighbors began to notice, whispering not about his wealth, but about his kindness. The way the millionaire CEO seemed transformed by the presence of one small girl. At home, he filled her shelves with books, crayons, and little things she never had, each one carefully chosen to spark her imagination. Lily began to draw pictures of houses, families, and bright skies, and she would bring them to Ethan proudly, showing him the world she was beginning to dream again. He pinned her drawings on the walls of his study, replacing business charts and financial graph, with colors of hope. In the evenings, they sometimes sat by the fireplace, Ethan reading stories aloud while Lily leaned against him, drifting into sleep with the security of his voice as her lullaby. Slowly, Ethan's own heart softened in ways he could not have predicted. His business meetings seemed less important compared to attending her school recitals, where he sat in the audience clapping the loudest. The once cold and calculated CEO found himself learning patience, gentleness, and the kind of love that did not demand returns, but only gave freely. He became her guardian not only in the eyes of the law, but in every action, every choice, every sacrifice he made. Lily no longer looked at the world with fear but with curiosity, her steps lighter, her smiles brighter. When she fell sick one winter night, Ethan stayed by her bedside, refusing to leave until her fever broke, holding her hand the same way she had once clutched her doll for comfort. He realized then that love was not about grand gestures, but about staying through the hardest nights. Lily too began to change, her laughter echoing through halls that had once been silent, her voice filling the spaces that had once only known the sound of business calls. She baked cookies with him one weekend, spilling flour across the kitchen, and for the first time in years, Ethan laughed until tears formed in his eyes. These moments stitched together a tapestry of family, neither of them expected, but both desperately needed. Each smile, each hug, each word of affection wove a bond that no wealth could buy and no hardship could break. The little girl, who had once sat forgotten on hotel steps, now walked proudly into school, carrying her books and her dreams. Ethan, once blind to the simple joys of life, now found his greatest success not in boardrooms, but in the warmth of being called a guardian, perhaps even a father. Their story was not one of chance anymore, but of choice. A man choosing to care, and a girl daring to trust again. And as they stood together, facing the horizon of days yet to come, they both understood that this was not an ending but a new beginning, a life built not on profits or pity but on love and belonging that would last forever.